by information or purported information given away on screens. So I'm going to start with some loose ends. Flattening the curve turns to zero infections. I just want to be sure everybody understands what's going on here and realizes the extent to which this illusion has been pushed on you. The illusion is very strong right now. Let me say that very clearly. The illusion is very strong right now. If you have not worked very hard to understand things, you have not worked hard enough to understand anything. The truth is not being given away for free on television. That is something that I try to remind everybody all the time. It's most certainly not being given away for free on Facebook or Twitter or any of these other services where a algorithm can throw things in front of your eyes that you don't necessarily choose to see. In these scenarios, including television, of course, and other media, in these scenarios, it is a very high likelihood that you're going to come in contact with information that's simply untrue because it's motivated by agendas that sit behind it, usually profit of some kind. So you need a guy like me. You need to find streams like mine that will help you sort through this fire hose of information. That's what this is all about. What kind of nonsense am I trying to talk about or address right now? It's this idea that didn't quite fit on there. Raising the line while flattening the curve. So the idea was that they wanted to move ventilators around and shuffle hospital capacity in such a way to raise the total capacity available in given regions where there might be a possibility of a huge local epidemic of coronavirus. They also talked about how with protective measures we could get this curve underneath the healthcare system capacity. That was the reason for the lockdown for the 15 days to flatten the curve, which then became 30 days to flatten the curve, which then resulted in my kids being out of school for almost 7 months. This is an unacceptable biological course of action because with all of these pictures, what you are seeing is a collection of lies, because all of these various graphics were presented to us as a plan. This is what we're going to do. We're going to get the curve under there and it'll be all good. And that's not what we're doing now. And we need to make sure that everyone in our lives understands this, that the parameters around which the change in our social and economic behavior are based have changed. And we need to be aware that they have changed to something that's almost impossible, and that is zero infections. The idea now is that when you open a university and you see students, some of which will test positive for a coronavirus with a PCR test, these are already considered very dangerous signs that certain doom is about to occur or that certain doom is just over the horizon. You can see it on every single social media stream, platform, anywhere you look. You can see this theme that essentially anytime you open up a university, anytime that university students have returned and the testing has begun, any positive cases are immediately spun as a disaster waiting to happen, and that the only reasonable course of action is to close this university to open classes again. And this was a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. There was no way, given the inaccuracy and false positive rate of this test, that we were going to get back to a open university campus where any particular campus would have no positive test results. That's impossible. And the lower the infection rate in a given population is, the more impossible this becomes. The prevalence rate needs to be high enough in order for such a crappy version of PCR tests to work. And I use these terrible words, and I apologize for that. We have a number of different variants of the PCR test available to us, all of which have varied levels of accuracy, none of which even approaches 99% accurate. The 70% false negative rate, the 5% false positive rate, these are crude measures and crude descriptors for how inaccurate these tests are. And given the fact that we don't know the prevalence rate in these students as they come back, what they are doing is actually creating a pretty nasty little situation. I'm going to stay on here just to preface this. The situation that they've created is one of travel and mixing, right? Everybody needs to come back to campus just long enough so that we can charge you full tuition and so that you can intermingle in our buildings and we can test you. We can use these false positive tests to justify a campus lockdown. We can justify it to justify extra costs. But in no way, shape, or form did they not know this was going to happen. Are you trying to say that there isn't a single college campus in America that couldn't have predicted that if they brought all their students back to campus that the result would be a significant population might test positive? Because that would be an absurd thing to assume. That would be more than absurd given the fact, again, that our tests are so darn inaccurate. There is no way we can reach a zero case level on any of these campuses. And when we open elementary schools and if we test those children, there's no way we're going to open with a zero case load if you just call cases positive tests. And so now the entire charade is based around PCR tests all being negative, a threshold or a bar that cannot be reached. This is a huge problem, folks. So I showed you these a few weeks ago. I just wanted to remind you again of these data. These are data from the U.S. for COVID already from July. So there's another month here that only makes this worse. And what I want to show you is in comparison, what I want you to see is that the Euro region, the percentage of people that's old is much higher than the percentage of people that's old in America. This is a fairly scary difference here. How many people under the age of 65 are dying? It is a fairly scary figure. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not. The death rate has gone down now. It's plummeted. But when we look at when the death rate was the highest, it is not that nice to compare the EU to America and notice that the number of people that are under the age of 65, even the under age 55, but under the age of 65, look at this. We are talking about, 20% versus 8%. It's shocking. And that all comes from malnutrition and obesity and other factors that are prevalent in America that aren't prevalent in the EU. These are not numbers that I'm showing you as an argument for lockdown. These are numbers that I'm showing you as an argument for opening up. Because these people, these unfortunate, very unhealthy people that have died of COVID despite not being in the age range that they are dying in Europe, that's the top. Besides not being in that age range, aside from not being in that age range, or despite being in that age range, they are dying in a higher number in America simply because there's too much obesity. There's too much malnutrition. And I've mentioned this a few times that one of the sort of stark realizations that you need to come to as you move forward in this pandemic is to just constantly turn your filter on as you watch television if you have to, or turn your filter on as you watch and listen to the various news sources that you allow to enter your stream. And ask yourself how many of them are mentioning basic nutrition all the time. I'm going to mention it every time you see me, from now until when the coronavirus is a myth and a legend in the past. And it's more of a source of convictions and criminal prosecution than it will be the source of profit. In that near future, you need to still remember where we are now and remember what I'm saying versus what PBS NewsHour hasn't said, or NBC News hasn't said, or Fox News hasn't said. That there are all kinds of well-known things that we can do to change our behavior, to change our nutritional basis for living, that will greatly increase our odds of having a asymptomatic or even, unseen asymptomatic infection of coronavirus. Because make no mistake about it, asymptomatic infection is healthy people. It's not lucky people. That's part of the illusion that they're trying to paint on the television. There is a biological explanation for why people don't get it severely, and that explanation has to do with age and health. That is shown very clearly in the EU, and it will be shown very clearly in America as the coronavirus pandemic progresses and you continue to watch herd immunity build and the death rate plummet. The case-demic will continue. As schools are opened and as universities are opened and as more young people are tested, you're going to see a continuation of this case-demic. What you need to understand, what you need to pay attention to is that the ICU admissions and the deaths need to track with the case-demic, or the case-demic itself is being conflated. There's been lots of talk about how it's 4 weeks. It's going to be 4 weeks. There's a 4-week lag. The 4-week lag has passed several times now for the second wave in Florida and Houston and Arizona, and the deaths are not keeping up. The deaths aren't keeping up because our treatment's better. The deaths aren't keeping up because we're not using respirators anymore. The deaths aren't keeping up because we're isolating patients in the correct way. The deaths aren't keeping up because we are treating people better and because the epidemic is ending. The pandemic is ending because we never really locked down. It went everywhere slowly. It's been everywhere. And if you couple that with our previous immunity from other coronaviruses, you have a perfect example of a charade. It's real. All the players are real. All the people on TV are real. Everything that they're talking about is real. The coronavirus is real. The danger to you and your family is what has been greatly exaggerated on purpose, I think. But for sure, it's been greatly exaggerated. Here's a wonderful paper that shows in culture that coronavirus replication can be completely inhibited. The culture that they use, incidentally, is an airway epithelial culture, much like we talked about for the enrichment experiments. Here what they do is they use a interesting combination of micronutrients, including quercetin. Quercetin, or this first substance, has been recommended by a number of different doctors, a number of different holistic folks, including the Jewish fella in Texas who is the hydrochloroquine king, with this protocol that has now been published in Germany, and was published with a couple authors that are from Harvard. The hydrochloroquine guy down in Texas is also suggesting that if you can't get hydrochloroquine, that this quercetin, I don't know how to say that, quercetin, I think. I don't know. Quercetin, which is a plant extract and available over the counter, is a great alternative to it. Turmeric root extract. Are you kidding me? I eat turmeric like 3 times a week. That's great. Green tea extract. I showed you a paper months ago which described the polyphenols from the green tea extract that can actually inhibit coronavirus replication. So this is really great. This is the kind of thing that, again, I would suggest to you that if we were really seriously facing something that untold numbers of people were in danger from, that the government would be doing everything they could to disseminate information like this, because a lot of this has been well known. Phantomide or Pepsid is also another agent that's known to inhibit coronavirus replication or coronavirus binding to membranes. It was one of the first drugs that was cited by some of the people in China that are working on bioweapons when the pandemic first broke out. And we're still not talking about that drug either. I'm going to try and cover that drug in detail next week. So this paper I showed you before, but I want to bring it up again because, again, we're still talking about herd immunity here, and we're still seeing figures on TV between 60-70% of the people need to be infected and recover before we're going to reach herd immunity, given the fact that we have so much asymptomatic spread, given the fact that we haven't tested anyone really significantly we're testing local locations en masse, but no one's been really tested in the Pittsburgh area. No one's, systematically testing anyone, so we don't really know for sure. Any serological study that has been done seems to indicate that there's widespread antibodies already available and widespread T-cell responses, which might indicate that the virus, or one like it, has been around for a lot longer. And that would, all of these factors would greatly reduce the number of people that need to get the new SARS-CoV-2 virus in order to induce herd immunity. And once we get to herd immunity, there's no vaccine necessary. Show's over, folks. And that's the reason why they're trying very hard to make this concept difficult to understand or even impossible to grasp. So some people ask me about the changing strains and how many different strains there are. I wanted to point you to this preprint. It is from Francois Balliot in the University of College London. I covered this paper before. In this paper, he also put out a little tweet thread that I can also show you here now. And he talks a lot about whether or not this is a flu or like a flu or equivalent to a flu. And what it does is he basically gives you the idea that it's probably kind of like a pandemic flu. And so it's dangerous, that's for sure. But it's going to go away, and it's behaving quite naturally. I'm willing to freely admit that Donald Trump said it would probably go away. I'm also willing to admit that many of the German respiratory physiologists or epidemiologists that I have followed in the past, have also claimed that, like other previous unknown or really unidentified coronaviruses, it will go away eventually. The one thing that we're dealing with here is a persistent virus, one that's not mutating very rapidly, and this, number one, could be a sign of its laboratory origin. Number two, could make it more dangerous than a natural coronavirus. But again, there's not much sign of that being the case. So to provide a meaningful comparison, he focuses on pandemic flu, and he looks at those in comparison to how many people are dying and how transmissible it is. And he says that for COVID, it's around 2 to 2.5, and that's pretty high end, at least for the last 4 flu pandemics. This is one of the main numbers for which we need to be concerned, because the higher the transmissibility is, essentially the more dangerous the virus is, unless it's completely innocuous when you get infected. And that's, of course, part of the question that I think is being settled monthly as we keep continuing to see the death rates around the world are plummeting to zero. And so it may be that there were some frail and vulnerable folks that got taken out in various places around the world because of the way the infection transpired. But that doesn't seem to be a rolling case that's just going to happen until all the dead wood is gone. I don't think that that's the case anymore, because, again, that's not how biology works. That's how it works in a model. That's how it works in a computer screen with all equal dots and everybody moving around equally. But that's not how real human populations behave. One of the things that he compares here is the transmission, the modes of transmission between influenza are the same. Interestingly, he also says that the pandemic flu was unusual and that it affected the young and healthy adults were in high risk. The COVID is dangerous for people older than 60, and children are essentially no risk, especially of death. That's a big difference, folks. That's a huge difference that was already paraded around back in May by this guy, and he's not backed off on any of these claims, and none of the papers that have come out since would give him reason to. So any life-threatening infection requires time to recover and can lead to long-term sequelae. That's one of the things that people are selling you all the time, that all these long-term effects of COVID are so strange and new. But it's simply not true. It's simply not true. The flu, pneumonia, any, as he says here, any life-threatening infection can take time to recover and can result in long-term effects. This is not crazy. And so the efficacy of flu vaccines is generally good in his mind. I'm going to talk about that. I don't have any liquid up here. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And I think he's arguing that COVID-19 here, the vaccine should be easier to develop. The reason why he's arguing that is because COVID is not changing, because it's a very stable virus, which is again a sign of it that its origin is unnatural. So in some ways it's advantageous, but mostly advantageous to people who would like to make a long-lasting, sort of permanently needed pharmaceutical product. There is no effective antiviral drug for either influenza or SARS-CoV-2. The best drug is Tamiflu, and it reduces symptoms by a day. That sounds a lot like remdesivir. Remdesivir is also not effective, and that's what he's saying here. He expects some seasonality, but that's yet to be determined. Again, the seasonality from some of these other coronaviruses may be their continuous. They're continuously changing. They are continuously evolving. The common cold coronavirus is quite stable. It just doesn't evoke much of an immune response. So we have yet to see what's really going to happen. But suffice it to say that most of the data from Spain, from Italy, the places that had the very early New York-like epidemics locally, where lots and lots of old and frail were killed in hospitals, and where there was a lot of nosocomial infection or hospital-borne infection that also got a lot of people. Those countries are having case demics that are simply not tracking with deaths at all. The deaths haven't gone up at all, even though they can find more and more cases. So they seem to be developing herd immunity. The same is throughout all of Scandinavia, and even though people are still trying to bash Sweden for having initially a lot of deaths, that just has to do with how many infections they had early and how quickly they controlled it, or whether they did control it, and that's just biology. Now they have herd immunity, and now they're open, and no one's wearing masks in Spain. No one's really wearing masks anywhere in Europe anymore. So this is a really big deal. Some people wearing masks, for example, on the train in the Netherlands, and some places it's required, but required from a advisory sort of manner, and certainly not in the crazy way that we're doing it in America right now, where people are running on the street, riding bicycles, even riding around in their cars with masks on. This is all absurd. If you're out on the street, you do not need to have a mask on. You can physically distance a little bit if you feel that's necessary, but in a sort of infinite volume environment, there's simply no reason to wear a mask. And this is just biology, I assure you. When you go inside and you think you're infectious, or you think that other people might be infectious, there might be an argument for wearing a mask. But as you know, Fauci was out very early this year already telling us that it's kind of a false sense of security for a virus, and that it might make you feel that you have some protection, but the protection is pretty limited. And so really it's about conformity, and it's about getting you ready for the other mandates that are coming soon. And that's what I want to talk about now. So it's really like a pandemic flu. Interestingly, the 1889 Russian flu pandemic might have been caused by human coronavirus OC43, which is now one of the common cold coronaviruses in circulation. So that's a really interesting pandemic theory that I hadn't heard of until he told me about it. So then you also have the 2009, the 2003 SARS, you have the 2009 flu, you have the 1977 flu. There's a lot of times when laboratory viruses have been released by accident, and so there's a lot of precedents in history that this one could just be another one of those. T cells and immunity is really important to understand. This paper came out a while ago showing you that when they inoculate or when infecting rhesus macaque monkeys with SARS-CoV-2, they get robust T cell responses. That's what you see here in these lymph nodes. What you see are the CD4 cells being converted from naive to activated T cells here. To a lesser extent, you see that also in the CD8 cells. This is important because, again, keep in mind that what they are trying to sell you with vaccines, and what they generally try to sell you on television, is that your immune system's response, the only one that really matters, is antibody response. And that's just clearly not the case, especially with coronaviruses, where the T cell response and activation is the most important. This is, again, just to zoom in on that CD4. This is a conversion from naive cells to activated T cells, and that activation is quite robust and significant. The same thing can be seen here with the CD8 cells, although, again, this the effect is not as significant, but the change is still there, where T cells are converting from naive to activated, and that means that they've learned an epitope that's been presented to them by dendritic cells, and that's this part. I apologize for not having the reference from which these figures come from. I feel a little ashamed of that. At the last minute, I couldn't find it. I will find it for you and update that. This point was made a few talks ago, but I think it's important to revisit it now because essentially we're treading water at this stage in this case-demic, and it's really important to be able to transfer this information to people around you. And so a very simple explanation for how your immune system works that puts antibodies at the very, 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 very end of the train of responses will allow you to teach your friends and family the reason why looking for antibody responses and watching antibody responses to SARS-CoV-2 is not a very good measure for the immune response to it and the potential for immunity in the human population as a whole. That being said, the first line of defense is skin, mucous membrane, cilia, stomach acid, and urine flow, i.e. the very barriers, the physical barriers between you and the external environment. This is the first and foremost barrier that any virus has to get past before that it can infect the cells that it can replicate inside of. This is a very important point because this is often glossed over by the people who want to completely discount this aspect of immunity as not being very significant, when in fact we know that it is. This is kind of the terrain theory versus germ theory thing. They want you to think that there's a choice there, but there's really not. There's not enough evidence to rule out the role that these first barriers play. Second line of defense is already the dendritic cells and the macrophages. The dendritic cells are the coolest because they are the ones that are crawling around autonomously looking for cells that are infected, looking for the proteins and the molecules that are causing the infection, causing the damage to the cells, and then trying to present those molecules to T cells in order to activate a downstream immune response. That is the essential first and second line of the immune system. We don't need to talk about anything else right now. And that's what's very important to get. You see how many cells are in here: neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils, mast cells, natural killer cells, and natural killer T cells, monocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cells. None of these cells are talked about on the news. None of these cell types are talked about on PBS NewsHour or on MSNBC or on Fox News about what we should be looking for, the signs we should be looking for as to whether or not herd immunity is already building up, as to whether or not asymptomatic people are actually combating the coronavirus with innate immunity, memory from other coronavirus sequences and other coronavirus infections. This is a really big deal, folks, because what we're essentially doing is being brainwashed into ignoring or forgetting all of the major players of the first two layers of the defense and try to think only of this one group right here, this one group of B cells and the proteins that they secrete, which is really absurd. It's absolutely absurd. So in this review article, the T-cell mediated immune response to respiratory coronaviruses is discussed by Stanley Perlman's lab, one of the foremost authorities on the original SARS-CoV virus and definitely a world-respected authority on SARS-CoV viruses in general. And in this, I need to get some water. In this paper, there is a diagram which shows you the basic response that occurs in the lungs in coordination with the cells of the lymph node and shows you the response to a coronavirus infection. Here you see the airway epithelium in the diagram in green. So out here would be the air in the lungs. The virus comes in via the air, by inhalation, and it can infect cells that are in the epithelium. When they infect the cells in the epithelium, the dendritic cells detect those cells that are infected and also detect the viral particles that they are secreting and can digest those viral particles as they go back to the lymph node, and they present parts of those digested viral particles in a complex with the major histocompatibility complex number 1. They present that to naive T cells in the lymph node. Naive T cells are T cells that haven't yet been told what epitope they should activate, what epitope they should seek, and what epitope they should be responding to. They're just waiting to be taught. So the dendritic cells actually migrate from the source of infection, in this case the lungs, and they travel to the lymph nodes where they activate these T cells. The T cells then migrate back to the lungs where they call in all of the cells that we were looking at here. These cells, neutrophils, basophils, natural killer T cells, these cells are called in, macrophages, these cells are called in to the location where this dendritic cell came from, because that's what the T cells do. They migrate back to the site of infection, and they call in the reinforcements. So in this diagram, what you see is a cartoon depicting inoculation. Inoculation by some molecule, some proteins that have something to do with the virus, and then an adjuvant. An adjuvant is just a inert inorganic substance that causes the dendritic cells in your skin to react, to become activated, and to try and find epitopes to present. They could present epitopes of the adjuvant, they could present epitopes of other substances that came into the same location as the adjuvant, and they can present the particles that were co-injected with the adjuvant. That's the whole idea of having an adjuvant. If you just inject a little protein into your skin, chances are you're not going to evoke an immune response sufficient to do anything. The macrophages and dendritic cells will just come in and dissolve those proteins and get rid of them. Proteases will destroy them. So in order to accomplish this, you have to trick the immune system. You have to teach the immune system by artificial means, get its attention by artificial means, and then trick it into presenting the proteins of choice that you give it. That's what vaccination is. Vaccination is an artificial means of giving your immune system information. And the trick is that so far vaccination is a very, very, very poorly understood art, because of the fact that the immune system is a rather poorly understood machine. The moving parts are very, very, very complex. They're related to one another through several different signaling molecules and signaling pathways. And and many of these cells move around autonomously, and so understanding them as a tissue is very difficult. But in this diagram, suffice it to say that downstream from the activation of the dendritic cells and downstream from the activation of T cells, naive CD4 positive and naive CD8 positive T cells get activated. These CD8 positive T cells do a whole bunch of stuff down here with cellular immunity, including the production of a lot of different substances at the end stage. And the CD4 positive cells, the cells that are attacked by the AIDS virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, the CD4 positive cells are the ones that differentiate into T helper 1 and T helper 2 cells, and the T helper 1 and the T helper 2 cells are the ones that activate the B cells that can produce the antibodies that are specific for those same epitopes, or a graduated version of those epitopes that was originally presented by the dendritic cells to the T cells. But any number of these cascades at the end can occur here, and none of them needs to be overrepresented in order to signify immunity. That is a false narrative. The only thing you need to know about immunity is whether you're sick or not. If you are coronavirus positive but asymptomatic and then become coronavirus negative, it is a very safe assumption from my estimation to assume that you have activated previously naive CD8 and CD4 T cells, which have mounted a response that was sufficient to get you through with an asymptomatic infection. And there is no reason to believe that that same learned immunity won't serve you the next time you run into this same quite stable virus. An advantage for everybody who has an asymptomatic case and develops T cell immunity, because this virus is so stable, the likelihood that this T cell immunity will last for you is quite high. And that, of course, is evidenced in these two papers. There's now 4 papers, 2 preprints, 2 prints, that show that T cell responses are present in people that have lived together with people who have been infected. They are present in people who've not been around people that have been infected, and they're very, very well represented in people that have been affected and recovered. So overall, what we're saying is the biology of coronavirus is just like we thought it was. It's just like we always known it was. Nothing unusual here. This paper was in Cell. This paper was in Nature. Both of them show T-cell responses in people that have recovered and T-cell responses in people that have never seen it before. Many of these appear to be overlapping open reading frame 1 regions that overlap with many different coronaviruses. Again, this compounds the problem of testing folks because the RNA for some of other coronaviruses overlaps with this one. The open reading frame 1 region contains domains that are extremely conserved among many different coronaviruses. Do we read that right there? That means that with poor selection of primers for any of these hundreds of variants of PCR tests, we could easily be having overlap with many different coronaviruses that we are not trying to track, may be also around, but completely not dangerous, but still giving us positive results that are not positive for SARS-CoV-2. The disingenuous swamp is deep, my friends. This is a paper from a long time ago, 5-6 years ago, that shows that the memory T cell responses targeting the original SARS virus last up to 11 years post-infection. I don't think we need a virus, folks, if we're showing robust T-cell responses amongst the vast majority of the adult and kid population. We simply don't need a vaccine. That's what I'm seeing right now. That's the evidence that I'm seeing right now. I can't discount my changing my mind in the future. This is a recent, very, very quick report just out maybe today, using a high throughput approach and looking at CD8 positive T cells, the ones that didn't show up so well in the monkey study that I showed you earlier, but were there but not significant. This is looking at CD8 T cells in individual mapping by mapping the T cell receptors to predicted peptides of the virus, and then seeing whether or not T cell receptor domains can be identified in people who've had SARS-CoV-2. The basic gist of it is that in 1,015 patients, looking at that versus control subjects, they found 23,000 unique virus-specific T cell receptor domains spanning the entire SARS-CoV-2 proteome. This means that people are developing a very robust response to this virus, and it's likely that even the asymptomatic people are. We are farther down the road than we thought, folks. Much farther down the road than we thought. I'm going to show you two papers here that talk about the trivalent, the tripartite, whatever it's called, inactivated the tripartite inactivated influenza virus vaccine. Oh my gosh, TIV. This thing has been applied to many people over many years. It has been applied to military personnel. It has been applied to kids. And because the flu affects people differently, because vaccines and vaccinations can affect people differently, it's important to really understand whether the flu vaccine helps. And the flu vaccine helps most of the time in given adult populations, as can be seen by this paper that was released this year. They looked at influenza in military personnel between 2017 and 2018. They looked at their kids on base and this kind of thing, and the results are pretty robust. The people that don't get vaccinated have a higher incidence of flu. It doesn't necessarily mean that those people are getting, they're not having problems with the flu, but the incidence rate is a little lower in the people that get vaccinated. But it's not zero. By any stretch of the imagination is it zero. In fact, the differences are quite slight. It's 40% versus 30% or something like that. So perhaps a 10% reduction in the adult flu rate in this huge population of military personnel. That's interesting. But more interesting is, for me, is this paper, which looks at kids. between 6 and 15 years old. And the reason why I think this is important is because one of the things that they're talking about in several states in the union right now is the possibility of requiring flu vaccines for the kids as they come back to school. And this, I think, would be an extreme mistake. This paper is more than anecdotal evidence to show you that there's reason to believe that inoculating children with the trivalent inactivated influenza vaccine, and that's what it's called, is actually putting them at higher risk for unknown coronavirus infections, respiratory virus infections like rhinoviruses. And in light of the current situation with the novel coronavirus, it seems very strange to start to suggest that one of the ways to combat the coronavirus vaccine and to prevent a dual wave this winter might be to inoculate the kids with the flu vaccine. And this paper and a couple other papers that are double-blinded do show that that might not be the best plan. And so I think this is probably my most important point to make today as we go forward, because I have seen this is the data from that paper that we can go back to in a second. I have seen several reports, also one from Virginia now, that they're going to require college students to have these college students and grade school students to have the flu vaccine in order to return to school. This is a big problem. It's a big problem for a number of reasons, but biologically it's a big problem because of the data that I just showed you there. And I think one of the things to see here, the people that are inoculated or vaccinated, and then these are the people that had the placebo. So the rate of influenza is higher in the people with the placebo, but it's not zero in these guys, right? It's not zero in the inoculated group. But most importantly, any non-influenza virus, okay? Any non-influenza virus. The rate in the in this group is so much higher than the rate in the placebo. It's absurd. Okay? So that's what we're talking about here. And this potentially could be a way of generating a second wave, because again, remember, these coronaviruses that are listed down here on the bottom are the coronaviruses that have overlapping proteins that are coded from the open reading frame 1 that was described in that earlier paper about T cells. Indirectly, they tell you that these coronaviruses have overlap, great overlap, and that overlap is significant in terms of providing innate T cell immunity for SARS-CoV-2. That's really an important point, because we do not want to be vaccinating children for the flu if in the end we are going to make them more vulnerable to SARS-CoV-2. Simply because, again, this will allow the amplification of a case-demic, which again has not justified closing down schools, simply because children are not being affected by this virus nationwide. You have to see the numbers. More children are being hurt by child abuse now, locked at home, than they are ever going to be hurt by SARS-CoV-2. And the argument that we're protecting old teachers and that kind of thing just doesn't hold water, given the sheer amount of danger and sort of suffering that we've been putting our children through over the last 6 to 7 months of having uncertainty, of having adults fighting, and having schools not open. Teachers need to do their job, just like nurses and doctors did, like EMTs did, and like the cashiers at every grocery store are still doing their job. The teachers of our schools need to wake up and apologize and do their job. But they are hiding behind legal. They are hiding behind lawyers. Lawyers are the ones who are going to close all campuses. Lawyers are the ones who are going to keep the schools closed. They are going to scare school administrators, scare university administrators into believing that there is no way to avoid the financial costs of the legal ramifications of opening and having people get sick. And they're using the case-demic to scare them, because none of these young people are being hospitalized in any significant number, and certainly none of them are dying.